Ethel, you're Chinese. Are you a Chinese peasant? I don't think so. You're living a pretty good life. And that's what I want to talk about today because the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, had the most, I guess, ignorant statement that's come out of the White House sphere in a while. And this was in an interview with Fox News I don't know, about a week ago, maybe a week and a half ago. And he called Chinese people, essentially all Chinese, especially anybody that's manufacturing goods for the United States, peasants.
Ask ourselves, what has the globalist economy gotten the United States of America? And the answer is fundamentally it's based on two principles: incurring a huge amount of debt to buy things that other countries make for us. And to make it a little bit more crystal clear, we borrow money from Chinese peasants to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture. That is not a recipe for economic prosperity. It's not a recipe for low prices, and it's not a recipe for good jobs in the United States of America.
Where do you even start with this? Ethel, where do you even start with this? You are really interested in being outside. This is one of those things where I don't know if it's intentional, if it's racist, if it's ignorance. I think it's all of the above. I looked into if J.D. Vance has ever been to China, and I couldn't find any proof that he's ever actually visited China. So I think it's mostly ignorance. But the frustrating thing is he's the Vice President of the United States, which means he has access to all of the information that the United States has, and he should know better. Not to mention, what he was talking about was economic trade and saying that the United States buys goods from China and we don't need them anymore, is basically what he was saying. It's like, we don't need to support poor Chinese people. We should bring manufacturing back to the United States, and basically saying that Americans are making Chinese rich. But at the same time, they're still peasants, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But basically, he's saying American manufacturing needs to come back to the United States, and he did it in a very crass way, which doesn't make any sense. And I guess it plays to his base, because if you are an American peasant, if you're the type of person that lives in, some farm, rural farmland where you've never left your state or even your hometown, and you believe that the reason that your economic situation is the way it is because manufacturing jobs have been sent off to, China or Vietnam or some other country, and your worldview, because you've only been consuming Fox News or news that portrays China as this poor, backwards country, then you would think, yeah, they're just a bunch of poor people, poor peasants living off of, $1 a day and barely surviving, and they're sweatshop, workers. And that's the mental image that has been pumped into the American mind for decades, to be honest, is that China's this backwards country of poor people, and the only thing that they have is cheap labor, which is the farthest from the truth that it could be. I lived there for many years, and I saw the stratosphere of the stratus, what do you call it? I saw, the poorest people in China, and I had dinners with some of the richest people in China. Obviously not the richest, but very wealthy people with, my jobs that I worked at. We met high level people. And there is a wide variety of incomes. There's a wide variety of ways that people live. And I didn't see peasants, at least the way that it's, kind of translated into English. In the derogatory way it's used in America. To call somebody a peasant is to call them the lowest level of human basically they're slaves is what you're calling somebody if you call them like a peasant. You're like just a peasant. It's awful. But it is very interesting that the Vice President of the United States would use this terminology. And it shows his character, I guess. And this is what we're getting to, is it shows his character is that he is playing entirely to his base, because somebody at his level should know what China is like. Even if you haven't visited China, even if he hasn't traveled there, he should know, because he has access to American data, right? He could access everything from the most classified reports of China's top secret, inventions and whatever they're working on that the United States has access to. He can have access to that. So he knows whether or not Chinese are peasants or not. And so he's playing to a base, knowing that this rural person in the United States who doesn't have access to this information and only watches Fox News will cheer. And that's exactly what we saw. We saw many people cheering in the comments and many people trying to defend his words, saying that he's right. And it's just not true. And I think the best comeback that I saw was from Victor Gao, who is a well enough known lawyer in Beijing. He's often on CNN and other news sites speaking about China and China's economy.
You will know the comments from the Vice President J.D. Vance calling the Chinese peasants. Where does that leave US-China relations and any sort of talks between the two presidents, do you think?
Allow me to be very brief. J.D. Vance and I went to the same law school, Yale Law School. I was 20 years ahead of him, and I'm ashamed for the ignorance and the bigotry he demonstrated, because he called China the peasants financed them, the peasants sold them goods. Let me just make one simple point. The middle class in China is larger than the total population in the United States. The urban population in China is about 3 times as big as the total population of the United States. So my advice to my alumni at Yale Law School, J.D. Vance, is wake up, or you go back to school to study more diligently to avoid making yourself a fool in front of the world.
And he was saying that, it's embarrassing because they went to the same law school, and it's embarrassing because he's just being idiotic and saying idiotic things. And he basically said the Chinese middle class is now larger than the entire population of the United States. So the United States has somewhere around 360, 70 million people. And the Chinese middle class is estimated, depending on the estimations, but it's estimated at the low end 400 million, at the high end 700 million people are in China's middle class, which is considered the middle class of China. So he was basically saying, what are you even talking about? Our middle class is bigger than your entire population, which is true. And I think that's what's really interesting to see, is in this trade war and all this that's going on, these comments coming out of the White House and by high-level members of the White House shows just how ignorant they are. Because J.D. Vance should know this. He should know it. It's public knowledge. You can Google it and, type in what is the size of the middle class in China, and it'll give you an estimate on the low end, 400 million, on the high end, 700 million, and it depends on, a bunch of different factors that each news website or researcher has used to come up with those numbers. But anyway you cut it, it's still larger than the entire U.S. population, which means most people in China, and which I've experienced, are living very comfortable lives. And they're very much in the middle class. And that doesn't mean they don't have struggles, and it doesn't mean that there aren't poor people. And if you really wanted to use the word peasant, you probably could get away with that to some extent. There are some people who are living off the land, who are farmers, and who are not wealthy. But to try and classify all of China as peasants is just moronic, and it's just infuriating because you're like, you should know better. And you are representing the United States as a country, and this is what you're putting out. Like, even if you wanted to say that China is poorer in some magical, non-racist way, you could look at the data and say, well, according to our statistics, the Chinese who work in factories only make this much money, so therefore we are, you could come up with a way to say it in a way that makes you not look like a racist and a bigot and a person who just hates Chinese people. Like, and I think that's the frustrating thing. I'm from the United States. I still hold a U.S. passport for now. I'm working towards not having a U.S. passport in the future, but that takes time. And so he still represents me because I'm a citizen of the United States. And when we see these people come out and say just the most moronic things, you just want to, like, he has such a punchable face with his little eyeliner and his, like, stupid comments. You're just like, you should know better. Like, you want to, like, you should know better. And I think he does know better. And that's what's even more frustrating, because he's playing to his audience. This is a individual who is completely spineless, because when Trump was running the first time, he said some pretty awful things about Trump. Because the first time Trump ran for president, most people didn't think he was a serious candidate and didn't think he was going to win. So people basically said, this is not what we want in the Republican Party. He's an awful person. He's a terrible, they said much worse things than that. And J.D. Vance was one of these people who said awful things. And then, 8 years go by and Trump's running again for president, and J.D. Vance completely flipped because he's an opportunist, and he realized that if he just says racist, vile things that Trump agrees with and with the audience that they're playing towards agree with, then he can become vice president. And the worst thing about somebody like him, like, although Trump seems to have no morals, I feel like Trump has just got an inflated ego. And that's a problem, but it's not a problem of an individual like J.D. Vance, who is young, ambitious, and now in the second most powerful position in the United States, which could catapult him to the next level. And if he sees that his base is racist and that's what they are responding to, then he'll just keep pushing that rhetoric forward. And he's the type of person that I think is more likely to engage in the most damaging policies, in the most disruptive kind of racist policies, whereas Trump is Trump. And, we kind of know who he is at this point. And it's the people around him that I think you have to be worried about. It's the, Stephen Millers. It's the Peter Navarros. It's the J.D. Vances. They're the ones that will push the actual policies that are really damaging to the United States, really damaging to the freedoms of the United States. And that's why I feel like he's just so, like, he should know better, and I feel he does know better, but he's just playing to that audience. And this is the type of person that is power hungry and could seek running for president in the next election, or in, 1 or 2 elections from now, when he still has that base that is still listening to him and thinking, oh, he's just like us, because he's willing to change his morals in order to gain that power. And I really just find this so insulting, not just to the Chinese people, which obviously it's insulting to them, but also to the American people, because he's supposed to represent the Americans on the domestic and international stage, and this is the type of rhetoric that he's putting out, which doesn't help anybody. And it's also just ignorant. But because his audience doesn't know better, and they have been brainwashed for decades to believe a certain way of looking at China because that's what the media has told them China is. They don't know that they're being lied to. So when he calls Chinese people peasants that are taking advantage of the United States for some reason and that we don't need them, his audience says, yeah, we don't need China. And they don't look at how international trade has actually benefited the United States for the last 40 years. They don't look at all the benefits that the United States has gotten from China, including being bailed out in 2008 when the entire financial system was going to collapse. Different story for a different time. But it's this rhetoric, this mentality that actually scares me even more than Trump, because this is the future of the Republican Party. If he doesn't, if he doesn't change the way that he's talking, he'll probably run for president in the next election, or 2 or 3 elections down the road, he'll probably run for president. And if he hasn't changed, and his audience hasn't changed, there's a good chance that he'll get elected. And then you have somebody like that in power, and that's scary, because they're the type of people that will go on and say something. Like, Trump will say something because he's just Trump. But this guy will say something knowing that it's completely wrong, knowing that it's a lie, in order to put his agenda forward. And that's probably more reckless than Trump, who's already very reckless with what he says. It's going to be interesting, because this power struggle between China and the United States continues to ratchet up. And if we have 4 more years of this, I don't honestly know. Maybe there is an actual conflict beyond just the trade war, because where does it go when the pain hits the United States, when people start to lose their jobs and start to lose their businesses and can't afford to buy things? And the rhetoric is, it's China's fault. China's responsible for this. It's not our policies. It's China, 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 China. And then people are saying, well, then why don't we go do something about it? And if they can create, I don't want them to do anything about it, but it's the direction that could happen. And then your home country will be attacked by my home country, and that would be really sad. And I think that's the biggest problem, is you would end up in a situation that doesn't de-escalate. And comments like this don't de-escalate the situation. Don't come back and say, you have a large middle class. It'd be better if we work together. There's policies that we could put forth. Yes, we aren't happy with trade with China, but let's actually get to somebody coming up the road. So you could come to agreements and actually get to a better place. And China's not, above making deals. They do it all the time with countries. And so I feel that's what you need, is somebody who can come to the table and say, look, China is a strong, powerful country. We respect that. And what we want is a mutual understanding so that both countries can prosper and move forward, and not have this rhetoric that causes more divide, that causes more, pain, I guess you could say, and more insult and more injury to what's already a tense situation. And so I feel like the next 4 years, because we've only been like 4 months, so the next 4 years, unless they get tired and they just can't keep it up, it's going to be a long 4 years. Let me know what you guys think about this comment. I saw some people in China trying to flip it and being like, there's nothing wrong with peasants. Peasants are, they're hard workers. And, my father was a peasant, or my grandfather was a peasant who worked the land and allowed me to be where I am today because of his hard work. And so that's interesting, seeing how some comments have flipped it and said, there's nothing wrong with being peasants. There's also a lot that have come out and said this is insulting and awful. What is your take on it? Do you think people like Peter Navarro and Stephen Miller and J.D. Vance are actually the bigger threat than Donald Trump, because Donald Trump just kind of does whatever people put in his head on that day? Or is it being blown out of proportion, and sometimes you let those comments slide because it's not true? Leave a comment, because everybody has a different take. I think it was super insulting to Chinese people who work very hard and have built a much better life in China for themselves through their hard work. And I also found it really insulting as a U.S. citizen that somebody who's supposed to be speaking for all the people of their country is saying these racist, bigoted, just awful things without an understanding, or even worse, maybe actually having an understanding of China and still willing to say it. So yeah, it's a double insult in my mind. Leave a comment and let me know what you think. And yeah, 4 more years of this, guys. We'll see. All right, see you in the next video.